Imagine you're watching this high-stakes championship game, right?
God, I'm picturing it.
And the referee is out there on the field, blowing the whistle, calling fouls, ejecting players for breaking the rules, just doing their job.
Right, keeping the game fair.
Exactly. You trust the referee.
Yeah.
But then, as you watch a little closer, you realize the referee is, they're actually wearing the jersey of one of the teams under their stripes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and not only that, but they're actively tackling players on the opposing team, just completely ignoring the rule book themselves.
That would definitely change how you view the game.
Right. And when anyone complains, the referee just kind of points to the rule book and says, well, I enforce the rules. I don't have to follow them.
Yeah, I mean, it completely shatters the illusion. You start to see that it's not a fair contest at all. It's just a system of raw power, where the rules are just a tool for the strongest player to dominate.
And that broken illusion, that exact feeling, is what we're unpacking today. Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone.
Thanks for having me. It's a heavy topic today.
It really is. We are looking at a deeply controversial, incredibly dense collection of writings by Noam Chomsky. Specifically, we're pulling from his book, Rogue States, The Rule of Force in World Affairs.
Yeah, and the mission here is to really distill a text that fundamentally challenges all those comfortable narratives we have about global politics.
Right, the standard stories about international law and the whole post-World War II order. Chomsky is making this really audacious claim that the world's most powerful nations, the ones literally drafting the international laws, are actually operating as the most dangerous rogue states on the planet.
It's a massive paradigm shift. I mean, he's basically asking you to view the geopolitical landscape without the polite diplomatic language we hear on the nightly news.
But before we dive into the mechanics of how he argues this, we really need to set a crucial baseline for you, the listener.
Absolutely. This is really important.
The source material we are analyzing today is highly, highly politically charged. It contains deep, systemic critiques of U.S. and Western foreign policy.
Extremely critical.
Yeah. So our purpose in this deep dive is absolutely not to take a side. We're not here to endorse Chomsky's worldview or push any kind of political agenda.
Right. Our role is strictly to be impartial reporters of this text.
Exactly. We are going to map out the architecture of his arguments, look at the historical events he selects as evidence, and just synthesize his logic. We're reading the brief to you, but you are the jury.
That framing is essential because, the claims made in this text are, well, they're meant to be deeply uncomfortable.
Right. They challenge everything.
Exactly. So to understand how Chomsky builds this case, we have to start by defining the terminology, right? We need to look at the psychological framework he thinks governs how citizens view their own governments.
And he relies heavily on this concept from George Orwell, doesn't he?
He does, yes.
Yeah.
Specifically Orwell's thoughts on nationalism.
Right. I always picture this like the ultimate irrational sports fan.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
You know the type. The fan who is stubbornly blind to their own team's blatant fouls. Like, they'll make a million excuses for why a dirty tackle was actually totally justified.
Sure, he tripped or the grass was slippery.
Exactly. But then that same fan will stand up and scream at the referee for the most microscopic, accidental thing the opposing team does. Their brain literally filters out the wrongdoings of their own tribe.
Yeah, and Chomsky takes that exact psychological blind spot, what he calls the Orwellian principle, and applies it directly to international relations.
So how does that play out on a national level?
Well, according to the text, the intellectual class and the media of any powerful state have, two primary public relations tasks.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, they have to portray the targets of their government's actions, so their designated enemies, as irremediably evil, just completely stripping them of any rational motivation.
They're just the bad guys.
Right, cartoon villains. And second, they have to portray their own government's actions, no matter how violent or destructive, as glorious, just, and fundamentally benevolent.
So even if the state is, dropping bombs on a civilian population, the narrative has to be that it's a tragic necessity for a higher moral good.
That is the core of the Orwellian principle right there. And Chomsky uses this to split the definition of a rogue state into two very distinct categories.
Okay, break those down for me.
So there's the propagandistic use of the term. That's simply a label applied by the powerful to any weaker nation that disobeys their orders.
Or challenges their economic interests.
Yeah, exactly. Then there's the literal use of the term. And a literal rogue state is just a state that does not regard itself as bound by international norms, treaties, or laws.
Well, we follow the logic of that literal definition, it seems like he's setting up an inevitable conclusion.
How do you mean?
I mean, if a literal rogue state is one that can just ignore international law, then the nations with the biggest militaries and the biggest economies are really the only ones who could afford to be literal rogue states.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they face no internal or external police force that can actually arrest them.
And Chomsky argues that logic and history absolutely dictate this outcome. A superpower will naturally fall into the literal category of a rogue state, simply because that foundational constraint on state violence is missing.
But wait, how do they justify that to their own people? If they're acting like a rogue state abroad, how do they maintain that illusion of benevolence at home?
That's where the text introduces this really fascinating idea, an inverse principle of outrage.
Inverse principle of outrage. How does that work mechanically?
The author argues you can measure the true moral function of a society's media by looking at what they choose to be outraged by.
Okay.
The principle is this. The more a country is directly responsible for a crime, meaning they're funding it, arming it, and actually have the power to stop it, the less outrage you will see in their domestic media.
Oh, wow. And the reverse.
Conversely, the less they can do about an enemy's crime, the greater the performative outrage and the louder the demands for intervention.
Okay, I have a really hard time swallowing this without a concrete example. I mean, we're taught that post-Vietnam, the U.S. underwent this massive moral awakening.
Right, the human rights era.
Yeah, especially under the Carter administration. The whole narrative is that foreign policy was completely recentered around, liberal internationalism.
Right.
Are you saying Chomsky views that entire historical shift as just a PR stunt?
Well, the text rigorously deconstructs that exact era. Chomsky acknowledges that the rhetoric shifted. Suddenly, every politician was talking about human rights. But he argues it wasn't a moral awakening. It was a crisis of legitimacy.
Because the domestic population had just watched the horrors of Vietnam on their TVs, right? The old justifications just weren't going to fly anymore.
Exactly. They needed a new shield. The traditional narrative of benevolence was completely shattered. So according to the book, the concept of human rights was essentially weaponized.
Weaponized how?
It became the new high-minded excuse required to maintain global intervention. And to prove this, Chomsky asks us to look at a glaring double standard during that exact era.
Okay, where does he point us? What's the double standard?
He compares the treatment of dissidents in Eastern Europe with the treatment of dissidents in Latin America during the 1970s and 80s.
Okay.
So Eastern European dissidents protesting the Soviet Union were elevated to absolute heroes by Western intellectuals and the press.
Which, I mean, is completely understandable. They were bravely fighting totalitarian oppression.
They absolutely were. But Chomsky points out that at the exact same time, their counterparts in Latin America, Catholic priests, union organizers, human rights activists, were suffering far worse state terror.
Really? Worse.
Oh, yeah. They were being tortured, disappeared, and assassinated by the tens of thousands.
And the crucial difference here, in Chomsky's view, is who was responsible.
Right. The Latin American regimes committing these atrocities were directly backed, funded, and often trained by the United States.
So that's the Orwellian principle in action. Because the U.S. was responsible, the outrage was muted.
It was almost non-existent. The text notes these Latin American dissidents were entirely ignored by the Western mainstream. Or worse, they were actively labeled as subversives to justify their murder.
So the human rights rhetoric was just applied selectively to the enemy and entirely suspended for the ally.
Exactly.
Let's see how this human rights shield holds up in a real combat scenario, though.
Yeah.
Because the rhetoric of humanitarian intervention really peaked in the 1990s.
Oh, for sure.
Take the 1999 NATO bombing of Serbia during the Kosovo crisis. The entire global flimsing of that operation was an absolute moral imperative to stop ethnic cleansing.
Right. The narrative was that NATO had to bomb to prevent a genocide.
Yeah. So how does the text challenge an intervention that was so widely celebrated as a humanitarian necessity?
Chomsky digs into the military timeline and the internal documents. And the text provides evidence that the NATO bombing was not a reaction to the worst of the ethnic cleansing.
Wait, what was it then?
He argues that the massive escalation of ethnic cleansing was actually the predictable consequence of the bombing.
Wait, predictable? Are you saying NATO commanders knew that dropping bombs would trigger mass atrocities on the ground?
That's what the text asserts. The author cites General Wesley Clark, who was the Supreme Allied Commander, Europe at the time.
Okay, what did General Clark say?
According to the text, Clark essentially admitted that an escalation of brutal atrocities by Serbian forces was the highly likely, entirely predictable response to the NATO air campaign.
Wow. So if the military commanders knew that the short-term result would be a massive spike in civilian deaths, what does Chomsky argue was the actual motivation for the bombing?
The author argues the primary motivation was about establishing what internal documents called NATO credibility.
NATO credibility. What does that actually mean, stripped of all the diplomatic jargon?
It means projecting undisputed U.S. hegemony. It was about demonstrating to the world, especially right after the fall of the Soviet Union, that the U.S. and its allies can and will act violently anywhere on the globe.
Whenever they choose, regardless of international law.
Exactly. And to underscore that point, Chomsky highlights the fact that NATO intentionally bypassed the United Nations Security Council to authorize the bombing.
Now we are getting to the absolute core of the international law argument. Okay, let's unpack this.
Sure.
If the U.S. and its Western allies helped create the UN specifically to prevent aggressive war, right? They drafted the modern architecture of international law after World War II.
They did.
So how does Chomsky reconcile the architects of the system deliberately bypassing and dismantling its authority?
He asserts that the system was never designed to constrain the superpowers in the first place. It was created to manage the rest of the world. Chomsky details what he calls a documented historical architecture of exemption.
Yeah.
He looks back at figures like Dean Acheson.
Acheson was the Secretary of State, right?
Yeah.
One of the big architects of the Cold War order.
Exactly, highly respected. And Acheson openly stated to the American Society of International Law that a challenge to U.S. power, position, and prestige is simply not a legal issue.
Wow. He just said the quiet part out loud. If our power is threatened, the law just doesn't apply.
That's the baseline philosophy.
So how does that manifest when a smaller nation actually tries to use international law against a superpower?
The text uses several high-profile case studies to show this contempt for legal constraints. A really defining example is the World Court case in the 1980s.
The Nicaragua case, right?
Yes. The government of Nicaragua brought formal charges against the United States. The CIA had been actively mining Nicaraguan harbors.
Which, I mean, that's an act of war, literally blowing up civilian and commercial shipping.
Exactly. And they were funding a right-wing proxy army known as the Contras to overthrow the Nicaraguan government.
But Nicaragua didn't respond with military force. They did exactly what the UN Charter tells a nation to do, right? They took their grievance to the International Court of Justice.
The highest judicial body on earth. They did. And the World Court ruled decisively in favor of Nicaragua.
Okay, so they won.
They won. The court condemned the U.S. for the unlawful use of force, ordered them to cease operations, and ordered them to pay massive reparations for destroying the country's infrastructure.
But if Acheson already established that U.S. power isn't a legal issue, let me guess. The U.S. completely ignored the highest court on earth.
They didn't just ignore it, they actively undermined the institution. The U.S. officially rejected the court's jurisdiction, calling it a hostile forum.
A hostile forum.
Well,
incredible.
And when Nicaragua went to the UN Security Council to demand a resolution forcing the U.S. to comply, the U.S. just used its veto power to kill the resolution.
And then what? Did they at least stop mining the harbors?
No, as a final demonstration of impunity, the U.S. actually escalated the proxy war and the funding for the Contras.
It goes right back to that referee analogy from the intro. The U.S. gets a red card, tells the referee they have no authority, vetoes the penalty, and then just tackles another player to prove a point.
That's exactly it.
But is this architecture of exemption strictly limited to military violence? What about trade and economics?
Chomsky shows how it applies to economic law as well. He highlights a major dispute within the World Trade Organization regarding the U.S. economic embargo on Cuba.
The WTO.
Yeah.
Which the U.S. basically created, right?
Right. And the European Union challenged the U.S. embargo, arguing that secondary sanctions, where the U.S. punishes European companies for trading with Cuba, were a blatant violation of international free trade rules.
That sounds like a pretty rational argument.
Yeah.
Did the U.S. submit to the WTO dispute mechanism?
Not at all. The U.S. rejected WTO jurisdiction entirely on that matter, invoking a national security exemption.
National security. Against European companies selling stuff to Cuba.
Chomsky frames it as deeply absurd. The idea that a global, nuclear-armed superpower faced a genuine national security threat from Europe selling medicine or agricultural goods to a small, impoverished island nation.
It's laughable on his face.
It was just naked power over international trade agreements.
This makes me wonder about treaties, though. You always see these massive signing ceremonies at the UN where nations commit to human rights standards. Don't countries actually have to abide by the treaties they ratify? How does a superpower wriggle out of a signed contract?
Well, the mechanism they use is called a reservation. The text explains how the U.S. uses these complex legal reservations to exempt itself from the very treaties it champions.
Can you give an example from the book?
Yeah, so the U.S. heavily promoted and eventually ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
That sounds like a foundational human rights document.
It absolutely is. But when the U.S. Senate ratified it, they attached specific, legally binding reservations declaring that the core provisions of the treaty are not self-executing.
Okay, I need an ELI 5 on that. What does not self-executing mean for an actual citizen on the ground?
It means the treaty does not automatically become domestic law, and it cannot be invoked by a citizen in a U.S. court.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it effectively makes the treaty legally inapplicable within the United States.
So you sign the document for the international photo op, you use it to lecture other nations, but you make sure a judge can never use it against your own government.
It's a remarkably cynical yet legally brilliant maneuver.
It really is. But, okay, if we zoom out a bit, all of this architecture, the vetoes, the reservations, the massive military spending, for decades, the singular justification for all of this was the Cold War.
Right. The Soviet threat.
The American public accepted these extreme measures because they were terrified of the Soviet Union. So a massive question arises. What happened when the Berlin Wall fell?
That's a great question.
If the Cold War was the genuine reason for the national security state, shouldn't the military budget have just plummeted in 1989?
That is the exact question Chomsky poses. And his analysis of the post-Cold War pivot is incredibly revealing.
What does he find?
According to internal documents he cites, when the Soviet threat evaporated overnight, the interventionist policies didn't change at all. The defense budgets didn't collapse. But the pretexts for maintaining them had to be swapped out instantaneously.
Well, yeah, because you can't walk into Congress and ask for a $1 trillion defense budget to fight an enemy that just dissolved into 15 separate republics.
Exactly. The Pentagon kind of panicked. Chomsky points to national security strategy documents released immediately after the Cold War ended. The planners shifted the justification away from the Kremlin threat and pivoted to a completely new narrative.
Which way?
A technological sophistication of third world powers.
Wait, what? They argued that developing nations, countries with a fraction of the GDP and no nuclear triad, were suddenly the existential threat.
That was the new official line. The text outlines how the pretext shifted wildly depending on the geographic need. Suddenly, the massive threat to the American way of life was Hispanic narco-traffickers.
Narco-traffickers.
Yeah, and this was the primary justification used for the 1989 invasion of Panama to capture Manuel Noriega.
Okay, I'm trying to remember the history there. Wasn't Noriega a longtime asset of the CIA?
He was. He had been on the CIA payroll for years. He was a known drug trafficker and a brutal authoritarian while he was an ally, and the U.S. government was perfectly happy to look the other way.
So why invade then?
The text argues he only became a target for a full-scale military invasion when he started pursuing an independent nationalist agenda. He stopped following Washington's orders.
So the drug trafficking was just the convenient propagandistic pretext used to sell the invasion to the American public.
Precisely.
What were the other pretexts after the Cold War?
Another major one was international terrorism. Chomsky points to the 1986 bombing of Libya under Gaddafi as a prime example of this pretext being tested and refined. Gaddafi was framed as the mad dog of the Middle East, entirely responsible for global terror.
Which justified military strikes. But if the Soviets weren't the real threat, and these shifting pretexts, narco-traffickers, terrorists, were just manufactured excuses to keep the war machine funded, what does Chomsky say the actual underlying threat was all along?
According to the internal planning documents cited extensively in the book, the true, consistent threat across the entire 20th century was never the Soviet Union. The ultimate enemy was radical nationalism.
Radical nationalism. That phrase sounds very academic. Can you break down what makes nationalism radical in the eyes of a superpower?
Sure. In the context of global empire, radical nationalism is the heretical idea that a developing country's resources, its arable land, its minerals, its oil, its labor force, should primarily benefit its own domestic population.
Rather than foreign investors and transnational corporations.
Exactly.
So if a newly elected government in the global south decides, hey, we want to nationalize our copper mines to fund public schools instead of letting an American or European conglomerate extract the wealth.
Then they are labeled a threat to global stability.
Wow.
Yeah, they are targeted for removal, either through CIA-backed coups, economic strangulation, or direct invasion, regardless of whether they have any ideological ties to communism or the Soviet Union at all.
It's all about the resources.
It's the fear of a good example. If one nation successfully uses its own wealth to uplift its poor, other nations might try the same thing. And the entire architecture of global economic extraction collapses.
That is a staggering claim.
Yeah.
It implies that the entire Cold War framing was essentially just a branding exercise for a global resource war.
It's a very sobering way to look at it.
And this brings us to a really dark corollary of Chomsky's thesis. We've talked about how pretexts are manufactured to attack designated enemies who embrace radical nationalism. But if the goal is securing resources and a favorable investment climate, the superpower has to rely on local enforcers.
Right, local allies.
What happens when an allied nation, one that is welcoming to foreign capital, commits horrific atrocities?
They are granted total impunity, and this introduces Chomsky's concept of the exempt rogue state.
Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly really dark.
It's arguably the most damning part of the book. The author presents a whole rogues gallery of countries that received massive, uninterrupted U.S. military and diplomatic support while actively committing atrocities against their own people.
Let's walk through the mechanics of how an exempt rogue actually operates.
Yeah.
Where does Chomsky start building this gallery?
He spends a significant amount of time on Indonesia, specifically under the dictatorship of General Suharto.
Okay, what happened there?
In 1965, Suharto took power in a military coup. Following the coup, the military and aligned paramilitaries oversaw a Rwanda-style slaughter. They exterminated hundreds of thousands of landless peasants, labor organizers, and ethnic Chinese citizens.
Hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
And what was the U.S. reaction to a slaughter of that magnitude?
The text notes that rather than being condemned, the massacre was quietly celebrated in Western capitals.
Celebrated, why?
Because Suharto had cleansed the society of leftist nationalist elements, and he aggressively opened the Indonesian economy to foreign plunder. Years later, the Clinton administration would literally hail Suharto as our kind of guy.
Our kind of guy. That is horrifying. But the strategy of plausible deniability didn't stop in 1965, right? What happened when Indonesia decided to expand its borders?
Right. In 1975, Indonesia launched a full-scale invasion of its tiny neighbor, East Timor.
And what was the result of that?
A brutal occupation. The text details how this resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Timorese. It was a massive genocidal percentage of the population, and it was backed explicitly by U.S. arms. 90% of the weapons used in the invasion were American-made.
Wait, how does the superpower handle the optics of that at the United Nations? If a country just blatantly invades its neighbor, doesn't the UN Security Council have to intervene?
They try to, which is where the diplomatic cover comes in. Chomsky actually quotes the U.S. ambassador to the UN at the time, Daniel Patrick Moynihan.
Okay, what did Moynihan say about his role during the East Timor genocide?
In his own published memoirs, Moynihan explicitly boasted about his assigned task from the State Department. He wrote that his job was to render the United Nations utterly ineffective in whatever measures it might take to stop the slaughter in East Timor.
He admitted that in print.
Yeah, and he coldly concluded that he carried out this task with no inconsiderable success.
To brag about deliberately disabling the international body trying to stop a genocide, simply because the country committing the genocide is a lucrative ally.
That is the literal definition of an exempt rogue state acting under the umbrella of superpower protection.
And this strategy wasn't just isolated to Southeast Asia. When you look at how the military-industrial complex needed to offload hardware in the 1990s, you see the exact same architectural blueprint applied in the Middle East.
Precisely. Chomsky shifts focus to Turkey in the 1990s. During this decade, Turkey became the largest single importer of U.S. military hardware on the planet.
Which begs the question, what was Turkey doing with a massive influx of advanced American weaponry?
According to the text, they were using it to commit massive, brutal ethnic cleansing operations against their own Kurdish population in the southeast of the country.
with American weapons.
Using U.S.-supplied jets, helicopters, and tanks. The Turkish military destroyed thousands of Kurdish villages, displaced millions of people, and killed tens of thousands.
And because Turkey is a crucial NATO member, holding the strategic line between Europe and the Middle East, the human rights abuses were just ignored.
Worse than ignored. Chomsky points out that the flow of American arms actually escalated in direct correlation with the atrocities. As the ethnic cleansing peaked, the weapons shipments increased.
That inverse principle of outrage again.
Exactly. Because the U.S. was supplying the weapons, the domestic American press paid virtually no attention to the slaughter of the Kurds in Turkey.
We've covered Asia and the Middle East. Let's look at the Western Hemisphere. What happens when the focus shifts to Latin America?
Chomsky details how Colombia eventually replaced Turkey as the leading recipient of U.S. military aid under a massive initiative called Plan Colombia.
I remember the rollout of Plan Colombia. The entire framing to the American public was that this was the front line of the war on drugs. We were sending helicopters to fight the violent cartels.
That is the propagandistic framing, according to Chomsky. The text argues that the drug war in Colombia was entirely a guise. The U.S. military aid primarily flowed to the Colombian military, which was deeply, inextricably linked to right-wing paramilitary death squads.
How does Chomsky differentiate between targeting cartels and what was actually happening on the ground?
Well, the text details how these U.S.-backed military and paramilitary forces were responsible for a reign of terror that displaced over 1 million people. But they weren't targeting wealthy cartel bosses. They were systematically murdering peasant organizers, union leaders, indigenous activists, and anyone pushing for land reform.
So it was really a counterinsurgency war against the poor, masquerading as a war on drugs.
Exactly, and Chomsky highlights a profound hypocrisy in how Plan Colombia operated. The initiative specifically targeted peasant coca farmers, the poorest link in the chain, with devastating chemical fumigation from the air, destroying their legitimate crops alongside the coca.
While ignoring the actual kingpins.
Right. At the exact same time, the U.S. entirely ignored the massive, wealthy paramilitary organizations that actually controlled the drug trade, because those paramilitaries were doing the dirty work of clearing land and murdering leftists for the state.
It's just wave after wave of devastation funded by the taxpayer. Are there other examples in the text of this lingering, unacknowledged damage?
The author also highlights the ongoing tragedy in Laos. Decades after the secret U.S. bombing campaigns during the Vietnam War era, thousands of people, mostly children and farmers, are still being killed or maimed by bombies.
The bombies.
Unexploded cluster munitions littering the countryside. Chomsky frames this as a continuing humanitarian catastrophe that the U.S. establishment completely ignores, offering almost no funding to help clear the ordnance they dropped.
This creates an incredibly stark contrast.
Yeah.
On one side of the ledger, you have the exempt rogues like Indonesia, Turkey, and Colombia, who receive billions in weapons and diplomatic immunity while committing mass murder.
Right.
On the other side, you have the designated rogue states, the official enemies.
Yeah.
I really want to look at how Chomsky handles the ultimate villain of the late 20th century, Saddam Hussein.
Oh, this is a very important part of the book.
Because Saddam Hussein is universally recognized as a brutal fascist dictator. Does the text attempt to defend his domestic record in any way?
Not for a single sentence. The author is unequivocal. The text absolutely agrees that Saddam Hussein was a mass murderer, a torturer, and a brutal tyrant.
Okay, so what's the angle?
Chomsky's focus is on the breathtaking historical hypocrisy of the West's relationship with him.
Walk me through the timeline of that hypocrisy, because in 2003, his history of atrocities was the prime justification for overthrowing him.
Well, the text points out the deeply uncomfortable fact that the U.S. and the U.K. actively supported, funded, and armed Saddam Hussein while he was committing his absolute worst historical atrocities.
Meaning they were backing him during the exact periods they later pointed to as proof of his unique evil.
Yes. For example, when Saddam used chemical weapons to gas thousands of Kurdish civilians at Halabja in 1988, the U.S. response was not to impose sanctions or bomb Baghdad.
What do they do?
The Reagan and Bush administrations actually extended strong support to him, providing intelligence and agricultural credits.
Why? Why would they support that?
Because at the time, Saddam was fighting a brutal war against Iran, and Iran was the designated enemy.
So using weapons of mass destruction against civilians is acceptable, provided you are using them against the superpower's enemy. When did the calculus change?
Chomsky notes that Saddam only magically transformed into the Beast of Baghdad in the eyes of Western media when he fundamentally disobeyed orders by invading Kuwait in 1990.
And Kuwait was a vital U.S. client state.
And a massive oil producer. The moment Saddam stepped out of line and threatened Western oil interests, his past crimes, which the U.S. had previously ignored or facilitated, were suddenly dragged out and weaponized to justify a massive military response.
That perfectly encapsulates the Orwellian dynamic. Your crimes are invisible when you serve us and unforgivable the second you cross us.
It's completely conditional.
And how does Chomsky view the subsequent punishment of Iraq after the Gulf War? Because we didn't just bomb them. We instituted a decade-long economic siege.
The author intensely condemns the U.S. and UK-led UN sanctions regime placed on Iraq throughout the 1990s. The text explains that these sanctions did not target Saddam Hussein's inner circle. They targeted the civilian infrastructure of the country.
Like what?
They blocked the import of water purification chemicals, basic medicines, and crucial infrastructure parts.
What was the human cost of that policy?
Chomsky cites international diplomats and high-ranking UN officials like Dennis Halliday and Hans von Sponeck, who actually resigned their posts in protest.
Resigned over the sanctions.
Yes. They publicly called the sanctions genocidal. They cited internal UN reports showing that the blockade was directly responsible for the deaths of up to 5,000 Iraqi children every single month due to preventable diseases and malnutrition.
5,000 children a month. And that was publicly justified by U.S. officials as a tragic necessity to contain a dictator that Washington had previously armed.
It really highlights how civilian populations in the global south are viewed merely as collateral damage on a geopolitical chessboard.
Let's pivot to another designated rogue, one much closer to home. What about Cuba? They are the ultimate enduring target of U.S. animosity in the Western Hemisphere.
Cuba is a fascinating case study because it strips away all the Cold War illusions. The text details how the United States' obsession with controlling Cuba dates back long before the Soviet Union even existed, all the way back to the 1800s.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Chomsky cites John Quincy Adams's ripe fruit theory.
I am not familiar with that. What is the ripe fruit theory?
Adams argued that just as an apple severed from a tree must fall to the ground, Cuba, once separated from the Spanish Empire, must inevitably fall into the hands of the United States by the laws of political gravitation.
Oh, wow.
The U.S. just viewed Cuba as its natural geographical property.
So the intense hostility after the 1959 revolution was never really just about Soviet missiles or the threat of global communism.
The Soviet connection was just a convenient, later pretext. The true underlying threat of Cuba, according to the text, and here Chomsky relies on a declassified secret report written by historian Arthur Schlesinger for President Kennedy, was the virus of the Castro idea.
The virus, there's that biological contagious metaphor. What exactly was the virus spreading?
Schlesinger defined the virus as the idea of taking matters into one's own hands. It was the terrifying possibility that Cuba's successful defiance might inspire other impoverished, oppressed nations across Latin America to rebel against the archaic, semi-feudal socioeconomic structures that heavily favored U.S. investors.
The threat of a good example again. If Cuba, a tiny island, could improve literacy, healthcare, and living standards for its poorest citizens without submitting to U.S. corporate dominance, that infection might spread to Colombia, to Chile, to Guatemala.
Precisely. And that is why, according to Chomsky, Cuba had to be subjected to decades of relentless CIA terrorism, assassination attempts, and crippling illegal economic warfare.
It wasn't about missiles.
No, it was about ensuring that the experiment of independent development failed miserably so no other nation would dare try it.
Okay, this brings us to a really crucial pivot in the deep dive. We've been talking a lot about overt force bombings, invasions, funding paramilitaries, but Chomsky makes it abundantly clear that force isn't always delivered at the end of a gun.
Right. In the modern era, the most devastating, far-reaching force is often purely economic.
It is the systemic coercion of the global financial system. Chomsky spends a significant portion of the text analyzing the role of international financial institutions, specifically the IMF and the World Bank.
He does. And this raises an important question about who really benefits from the global economic order.
I always try to visualize this economic dynamic, right? It's kind of like a massive corporate bankruptcy.
How so?
Imagine a corrupt CEO takes out a massive corporate loan from a major bank. The CEO uses that money to buy himself a fleet of private jets, builds a mansion, funnels millions offshore, and the company inevitably goes bankrupt.
Okay. Tracking.
But instead of the bank seizing the CEO's jets, the bank forces the company's frontline minimum wage factory workers to pay off the massive debt out of their own paychecks while the CEO retires comfortably. That is essentially what Chomsky's arguing happens on a geopolitical scale with sovereign debt.
That is an incredibly accurate analogy for what the text describes as odious debt. Chomsky discusses the Jubilee 2000 movement, which was a global campaign to cancel third world debt. He argues that a massive portion of the debt burden crushing the global south is legally and morally odious.
Can you break down the legal concept of odious debt?
Sure. In international law, odious debt is defined as a debt incurred by a despotic power or a corrupt elite without the consent of the people and for purposes that did not benefit the people.
Okay.
The text points out that during the Cold War, Western banks and institutions eagerly pushed massive loans onto brutal dictatorships like Suharto in Indonesia or Mobutu in Zaire.
And the money just vanished.
Much of that borrowed money simply ended up as capital flight, sitting right back in Western bank accounts or real estate belonging to those corrupt elites.
But the dictators eventually die or get overthrown. What happens to the debt?
The bill remains with the state. When the democratic successors or just the impoverished citizens inherit the country, the IMF steps in and demands repayment.
And how are they forced to pay it back?
Through brutal IMF structural adjustment programs, or SAPs.
I hear that term constantly in global economic news. What is the actual on-the-ground mechanism of a structural adjustment program? Like if a country defaults, what does the IMF physically force their government to do?
The IMF demands that the debtor nation radically restructure its economy to ensure foreign creditors are paid first. Mechanically, this means slashing public spending to the bone.
Slashing what exactly?
The government is forced to eliminate subsidies for basic necessities, like bread, cooking fuel, and public transportation. They must gut funding for public health care and education, and they're forced to orient their entire economy away from producing food or goods for their own people and toward producing cheap exports to earn the hard currency needed to service the debt.
So, to go back to the analogy, the factory workers aren't just paying the CEO's debt. They are being forced to sell their own tools and skip meals just to make the interest payments to the bank.
It is the ultimate socialization of risk and the privatization of pain.
Chomsky explicitly makes that comparison, doesn't he?
He does. He looks at the U.S. savings and loan bailout in the 1980s. When rich domestic investors and banks made terrible, risky bets and failed, the U.S. government stepped in and socialized the cost, forcing the taxpayer to bail them out. But when foreign dictators default on loans, the IMF steps in to ensure the Western banks are bailed out, while forcing the poorest people on Earth to absorb the actual fatal cost through shattered living standards and starvation.
This ruthless economic mechanism is also how Chomsky analyzes supposedly beneficial free trade agreements, right, like NAFTA. The mainstream consensus is generally that NAFTA was a massive success for free markets.
It is heralded as an economic miracle if you are looking strictly at macroeconomic statistics, corporate profits, and the volume of cross-border trade. But Chomsky provides a starkly different view from the ground in Mexico.
What was the reality there?
According to the author, NAFTA effectively devastated the purchasing power, the wages, and the agricultural livelihoods of the Mexican majority.
Wait, how did a free trade agreement destroy agriculture?
Because it wasn't truly free trade, NAFTA forced Mexico to open its borders to heavily subsidized agricultural products from the United States, specifically corn.
Oh, I see.
Massive taxpayer-subsidized U.S. agribusiness flooded the Mexican market with cheap corn, completely wiping out millions of small-scale, independent Mexican farmers who simply couldn't compete with the U.S. Treasury.
And what happened to all those displaced farmers?
They were forced to migrate to the cities or to the border maquiladoras, which ended up driving down wages across the entire country.
If the economic outcome was going to be that devastating for the majority of the population, how did the Mexican government get away with signing it? Wouldn't the public vote them out?
The text cynically notes a point that was actually made quietly in the U.S. financial press at the time. Mexico's great benefit during the NAFTA transition was its dictatorial political structure.
The PII party.
Right, the ruling PRI party functioned essentially as a one-party state. This authoritarian structure allowed the government to force the extreme pain of these neoliberal economic rules onto the poor without facing any genuine democratic pushback.
So a truly democratic society would have never accepted the terms. That is incredibly bleak. It paints a picture of this inescapable global cage. But does Chomsky's text highlight any instances of successful resistance to this economic hammer? Does the public ever actually win?
It does, and it's really important to end on this note of resistance. The author touches on the Cochabamba water protests in Bolivia. This occurred right around the time the book was published, and it serves as a prime example of popular grassroots resistance against the Washington Consensus.
What exactly happened in Cochabamba?
The World Bank heavily pressured the Bolivian government to privatize its public water system in the city of Cochabamba. The government complied, and they sold the rights to the water to a foreign transnational consortium led by the Bechtel Corporation.
And what did the corporation do once they had a monopoly on the water supply?
They immediately jacked up the water rates. In some cases, water bills doubled or tripled, instantly putting basic drinking water out of reach for much of the city's impoverished population.
That's insane.
It gets worse. The consortium even asserted legal rights to the rainwater that people collected in buckets on their roofs.
Wait. They literally charged people for the rain. It sounds like a dystopian novel.
It was the logical extreme of privatization. But the populace fought back. A massive coalition of factory workers, farmers, environmentalists, and indigenous groups organized sustained massive protests. They paralyzed the entire city with general strikes and blockades. Despite the government declaring martial law and using deadly force, the people held their ground. Ultimately, they forced the foreign corporation to flee the country and forced the government to legally rescind the privatization contract.
So, when pushed to the absolute brink, organized public resistance can actually break the market discipline that these institutions try to impose.
It's a stark reminder within the text that the system is not omnipotent. The power of the rogue state relies heavily on compliance and the illusion of inevitability.
Wow. We have covered a massive, heavy scope of material today. We've looked at the psychological blinders of the Orwellian principle.
Yeah, the sports fan analogy.
We've seen how pretexts for war, from communism to narco-trafficking to terrorism, magically shift the moment old enemies disappear, ensuring the defense budget never shrinks.
Constantly moving the goalposts.
Exactly. We've walked through the dark gallery of exempt rogues like Indonesia and Colombia who are allowed to commit atrocities with American weapons and diplomatic cover, while designated rogues like Iraq and Cuba are crushed with genocidal sanctions for the crime of disobedience.
It's a very heavy contrast.
And we've unpacked how the global economy is structurally rigged to ensure that wealthy investors always socialize their risks, while the poorest populations are forced to pay the odious debts of their dictators.
It is a sobering, highly critical lens. Chomsky's sources present a worldview where the word stability is just diplomatic code for maintaining the wealth and power of the global elite.
And rogue state.
In his view, rogue state is nothing more than a propagandistic label applied by the powerful to anyone who disobeys them, while the superpower permanently exempts itself from the very international laws it claims to champion.
We want to remind you, the listener, that this is the specific, documented perspective of Noam Chomsky. It's a deeply challenging, intentionally provocative way to look at the news, at historical narratives, and at the core motives of the most powerful nations on Earth.
It really asks you to strip away the high-minded rhetoric and follow the physical actions, the flow of the money, and the serial numbers on the weapons.
It asks you fundamentally to question the referee, to stop looking at the flags they throw and look at the jersey they're wearing underneath.
Exactly.
And that brings us back to our opening thought. If the referee is playing for the other team and actively tackling players, what game are we really watching? Which leaves you with a lingering, somewhat uncomfortable question to mull over as you go about your day.
What's the question?
Based on everything we've unpacked, if international law is entirely, systemically unenforceable against the superpower that drafted it, and is only ever weaponized against weaker, disobedient states, does international law actually exist at all?
That is the big question.
Or is it merely a polite, theatrical language of diplomacy, a script used by the powerful to manage the public optics of raw, unbridled geopolitical violence? Something to think about the next time you hear a politician invoke the international community. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We'll see you next time.